Good evening, gentlemen. Better late than never. Apologies for the delay, but we made it. We are studying. Would you mind closing that door? I'd appreciate it. Thank you. We are studying the 6th chapter of the Holy Tanya, where we finally get to discuss Klipa Sitra Achra and all the other fun stuff, all the other not nice things, things that are in opposition to holiness, which is actually literally the topic of our discussion. We began last week to define what we mean by holiness and the opposite of holiness, right? The Alter Rebbe says that all the things that are loy LaHashem hema, all the things that are not directed towards God, all the things that are not of God or godly, are negative. They're negative, bad, quote-unquote things. And we spent a lot of time last week discussing how the Alter, it is really a lot of review from chapter 1, that the Alter Rebbe's definition of bad, when we talk about Klippa and Sitra Achra, right, as being bad or negative, the sense in which they're bad and negative is the sense in which they are the opposite of godliness. Not necessarily that they're a great moral negative. We discussed how this is how you get the irony of the academic translation of Sitra Achra as the demonic or the demonic powers. And in fact, according to the Tanya, a cheeseburger is quote unquote demonic, right? In other words, when you mean the opposite of God, it's not that our definition of the cheeseburger should change necessarily. Our perception of the cheeseburger at a moral level. We should not become anti-cheeseburger, burn the cheeseburgers like they used to burn heavy metal records or things like that because they're demonic, right? On the contrary, what this tells us is that what the demonic means is not like the English word and its connotations. We do not here mean something that is a power, God forbid, other than God, which we don't believe in Judaism, or a power and even in opposition to God, we don't really believe, as we'll actually see more, God willing, as the chapter goes on. We simply mean that there is holiness, there are things that are godly, and then there's everything else. Essentially, there are two options. Something can be a divine I am. Something can be an expression of God's existence, an expression of God's presence, or something can be a separate I am, a nifrad, as we're going to call it later in this chapter, something that is separate from godliness, something that perceives itself to be independent, or as we've been calling it, the worldly I am. This distinction between the holiness and godliness on one side and everything else on the other side is best captured by the term we've been using since chapter 1, Sitra Achra, which means the other side, right? In other words, the Sitra Achra is the term that most captures the fact that we're simply talking about non-holy things. The things that are non-holy, right, are the things, is everything else. That's not holiness by definition. And that's what we mean by Sitra Achra. But then we said, well, if the Sitra Achra is everything that's not holiness, so what is holiness, right? And we said that holiness is the presence or the indwelling of God, right? It has to do with the dwelling of the holiness of God. What does that mean? We said it means that everything that has bittul, this is the last thing we read last week, everything that has bittul, everything that is nullified, right, is the only place where holiness can dwell is in things that are nullified, is in things that become negated, things that become non-separate, non-independent realities or beings. And this really ties back again to the whole concept of Sitra Achra being I am, because really, when you understand that holiness is God saying I am, you realize that holiness, therefore, cannot be created by someone other than God. In other words, there's only that which God makes holy, because holiness is an expression of God, right? So no matter what form a person might take or how a person might look, it does not, or in other words, how a person might look spiritually, how they might look in their service of God, they do not attain this level of holiness just by their own efforts. Or to put it in a cute way, it doesn't matter how refined or how good or how lofty the I am becomes. Even if a person says, I am a very good person who helps little old ladies cross the street, that doesn't make them the divine I am, because it's still their own ich, it's their own I, it's their own self, right? The self that has become separate from the divine self, whereas holiness is the divine self. Now, no, please.
If somebody creates the feeling according by the book and it's kosher.
That's not creating. You can't create fun.
Forming the feeling.
God.
No, but immediately it becomes God put the kedusha in it, even though you created it.
You don't create anything. You form, you take the leather and you work the leather into the form of the tefillin, but only God chooses that the form of the tefillin is holy. Right. You can't decide. You can't make something. You can't make a tefillin that has 5 divisions instead of 4 divisions, right. 5 parshas instead of 4 parshas, and decide that this is holy, and it's even more holy because it has 1 more parsha, right? The whole concept is ridiculous, because God decides where the holiness of God is, because that's what holiness means. Holiness means the presence of God. So when you form leather into a certain shape, you're not making holiness. You're making something that God decides is holy. You understand? You can't make a form of holiness. A person could be a very good person, a very righteous person. It has nothing to do. The two things are totally unrelated by this definition. Holiness is the presence of God, right? You understand this a little bit better, actually, if you think about how if you ask the question, what is it that makes the you ask the question like this, right? What is it about something being, because we're saying holiness is associated with bittul, right? So on the one hand, what we're trying to say, and really what we were trying to say in last week's class, is that holiness is not associated with any particular worldly or defined thing, right? But on the other hand, we're saying it is associated with bittul, however, right? So the question, you could ask the question, how could it be that God is associated specifically with bittul? Because the fact is that all things come from God. So why wouldn't the fact that the Sitra Achra is separate from God, separation also comes from God. Right. So the whole concept comes from God. Opposition to God comes from God. There is no real opposition in Judaism, right? Everything is of God actively at every moment and literally an expression of godliness, right? That's the bottom line. So when you're making this Kedusha Sitra Achra distinction, right? The point is not that the Sitra Achra has no connection to God. In fact, as we're going to learn, God willing, that's kind of the topic of tonight's class, that the Sitra Achra does have a connection to God, right? So when we say that the Sitra Achra is the opposite of Kedusha, right? What are we saying? We're not saying it's the opposite of God, because Kedusha is not God. Kedusha is the Hashra of Kedusha. It is the Shechina. It is the presence of God. The presence of God is very different from God. The presence of God means, what does it mean to be present somewhere? Right?
Being not present somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Not if you're God.
That's true. No, in a way that's true. In a way that's true. But what does it mean to be present, though? What it means to be present means that not only are you here, but you're here by the definition of the location where you are, right? In other words, when God is everywhere, which is true, even in the Sitra Achra, God is there. There's no place where God isn't, right? But the way God is there is in a way where he may be there inherently because he's God, but the place rejects him. The place does not have room for God on its own terms. In other words, the place, if you ask the place where God is, in the Sitra Achra, it would say, this is a place of a different self. This isn't the place of the divine self. Even that comes from and is within and is totally one with godliness in its way, right? But the whole game, so to speak, the whole purpose of the distinction has to do with the terms of the thing itself, the terms of the receiver, the term of the defined thing, rather than by God's terms inherently. Or to put it slightly differently, God was everywhere inherently before anything was created. So if that was the whole kunz, if that was the whole purpose, if that was the whole goal, right? Nothing had to have been created in the first place. God was already everywhere. So now he's also everywhere, but that's not. So that doesn't say anything, right? God's always everywhere, right? We don't believe the tzimtzum is kipshuta. We don't believe that God is not here. We believe God is here like he's always been here, right? So everywhere, literally. So, when we say that the Sitra Achra is the opposite of Kedusha, we mean in the terms of those things themselves. Or to put it slightly differently, we mean that God is hidden there, not that he's not there, right? It's a question of Gilui and Helem, not a question of presence and non-presence. God is in the Sitra Achra, but how is he there? As we're going to read in the Alter Rebbe's words, he's there in a way of galus. Holiness is there in a way of exile. It's concealed. The holiness is not there, right? In the place where the holiness is, it's not just we say it's the divine I am. It's God saying I am, which in a way that it's heard, in a way that it's expressed, right? As opposed to God inherently being everywhere, which is not a statement, right? That's why I keep saying it's God saying I am, because it's a communication, right? In the language of the mashpiyim of Chassidus, the teachers of Chassidus, they're always talking about what do you hear in this place, right? Even if no one is speaking, right? But it's a spiritual question. What's heard there? What do you feel in the thing, right? What's the essence of this thing in experience, right? So Klippa and Sitra Achra is not the opposition against God, it's the opposition against holiness. It's the opposition of the felt presence of God, the true expression of God, right? God is everywhere. It's a question of whether he's expressed or not. And really, this is the general gist of tonight's class, right? Now, and the basic, as we started before we went off on this tangent, the litmus test is bittul versus yashus, right? What determines whether something is holy, it's whether it is nullified. Or to put it very simply, you can't have God saying I am in a place where the thing is saying I am, right? You can only have one or the other. If the thing is saying I am, if there's a separate I am in that place, right, then you can't have God saying. I am. I think we're going to see by the end of tonight's class that this means, really we're already saying this in the first chapter, I'm just bringing this out more, this means that you have to look at existence itself in a whole different way, really, right, is the truth. Because existence itself, as we normally define what it means for something to exist, is really the definition of the Klippa and Sitra Achra. It's really the definition of not holiness, right? To understand, to have a bit of a chap, a bit of a grasp of what holiness really is. In other words, the truth of things, right? A person has to have a bit more of an edel. You have to look beyond the surface level. You have to have a more refined perspective. So holiness is God, and is God saying I am in an accepting context, whereas the Sitra Achra and everything else is God is there, but it's not an accepting context, it's a rejecting context. Or as we put it in chapter 1, God creates things that are alienated from their own source, from the truth of what they really are. God creates things to be in denial of what they are. Everything is rooted in God. But Klippa and Sitra Achra is in denial of the fact of its own root. It's in denial of its own, the truth of its own existence. Okay, let's read the holy words of the Alter Rebbe. We are in chapter 6, of course, page 20 in the Hebrew, 24 in the English. We are actually in the middle of a sentence, as is typical. Nearly in the middle of the page. We are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, or 11 lines, pardon me, 11 lines down from the bottom of the page. The line ends with the word mamish. In the Hebrew, we're right there, a couple of words before, where the line ends mamish. In the English, we're near the bottom of the first column where it says, as in the case of. Near the bottom of the first column on the page 24. Says the Holy Tanya, says the Alter Rebbe, we just finished saying that God only dwells in something that's nullified to him. A reminder we have mentioned in this class before, I'll mention it again, that in Chassidus there is no, it's really directly connected in a very backwards way that I won't explain now to the topic of our whole chapter. But in Chassidus, when you say something is nullified, it's always nullified to something. There is no just nullified. In other words, there's no bittul stam. There's no just nullification, right? When something is nullified, it's nullified within and to something else, right? This definition of bittul goes all the way back to halacha, right? Bittul, when you learn smicha, different foods become bittul. It's the same idea. You become nullified to or within something else. There is no just nullification, right? Which already gives you a hint that bittul does not mean self-destruction. It means self-abnegation. It's totally different in the real proper translation, right? Or self-nullification. But that does not mean self-destruction. On the contrary, self-destruction is a form of yeshus, right? It's more complicated than you think it is. Self-destruction, if you destroy yourself, all you do is become more apart from God, right? You want to be nullified to God, which is not self-destruction, but usually the opposite. Anyway, I'm just pointing out to you, this is because it's not to nullify yourself. The point is not to not be in any profound sense. Dying doesn't really make you not be, by the way. If only it were so simple. Can't escape that easily. But anyway, the nullification does not mean self-destruction in any way. It means being nothing other than an expression of God. And how great something is God. God is infinitely a great something. And so a lot of people who are very buttle are not very small or insignificant. On the contrary, they are very great and very significant. It is simply that their greatness is an expression of God's greatness rather than their own. Yes? The Shekhinah only dwells, holiness only dwells in things that are, the presence of God only dwells in things that are nullified to him. Bein b'peil mamash, whether in actuality, kamalachim elyonim, like the supernal angels, right? The supernal angels, eisim be'emel v'yiratzayin kenam, right? They do with fear the will of their creator. The angels are totally bottled to God. That's really what the word malach means. A malach means a messenger, right? As every child that goes to Hebrew school or reads a little midrash says, which all of them should, knows that the angel means messenger, right? The word malach means a messenger of God. So Chassidus just says, if you look deeper into what it means to be a messenger, you'll realize it's a form of bittul. That's what a messenger is, right? A messenger is, it's a form of expression, self-expression, right? You have something that goes out, someone else, but what is the someone else? They're nothing but a representation of you. That's what a messenger is, right? A messenger, an emissary, right? So the emissaries of the divine are actually holy by definition. That's what a malach is, right? An angel is something that by definition is an existence of bittul. Its whole existence is only to express God, right? Now, of course, as we mentioned again last week, and I should point out again, there's many different levels of bittul, right? So the bittul of an angel, no matter how great the angel is, still the bittul of a creation, right? A creation that is nullified and has no other purpose except to express God is still a creation, right? Then the bittul and nullification of, for example, godliness itself, like the bittul in the world of Atzilus, for example, in the world of emanation, the divine world, right, which is before anything is created, separate from God, will be a whole other higher level of bittul. And of course, within the angels themselves, as our resident Kabbalists for sure know, there's all different ranks and different levels and of all different angels, all with different levels of bittul. And there's many beautiful Hasidic discourses which examine the different types of bittul of the different malachim, which is very important because we talk about it in davening before Kriya Shema, and that's actually the point in davening. If you remember our Maimer, Naisa Na'aliyas Kirkatana, which we learned from the Frierdiker Rebbe about davening, right? That the it was only for like 2 or 3 months. This wasn't a big deal. But so in that minor, we spoke about how the real bittul of the animal soul in davening is in Birchas Kriya Shema, but is when we're talking about the angels. The angels and the animal soul have a special connection, right? Anyway, so you have the angels are bittul by definition, right? When you think of bittul, right? When you want to say bittul is going there, you would say it's literally a malach, more or less, right? It's either a malach or something like a malach that's either lower or higher. It's either an angel or something like an angel that's either higher than an angel or lower than an angel, because its entire being is just to express godliness in one way or another. Yeah, and again, there's many different levels. It's of course true that you could say there's a type of nullification from whose perspective the nullification of the angels is insignificant, right? In other words, an actual angel from a higher perspective might actually be considered a yesh because it's a creation. It might be considered not nullified, something separate from God by a certain definition. You understand? But in other words, but generally speaking, the angels, certainly relative to our definitions, this is a chapter about the Nefesh Bahamis, right? About the animal soul mostly, right? Relative to the animal soul, an angel is a definition of bittul. An angel exists only to express God.
Just like Eliezer said, Eved Avraham Anochi, he defined himself like to be the
very Hasidic comment, actually, in its own way. I know you enjoy the compliment deep down. I have a joke that I'm not going to say, but that I heard from a certain rabbi. But the Eved Avraham Anochi is a perfect example. It's the example of shlichus in the Torah, right? That's why the Kinnis of Shluchim is always on Parshas Chayei Sarah. Or, if you prefer to be more accurate, why Parshas Chayei Sarah always falls out on the Kinnis of Shluchim. Anyway, the Malachim Al Yodim. That was just to annoy you. That was just to annoy you.
No, because they can't go to Hebron at that time, so they choose.
That was just to annoy you. Well, Hebron, you mean to see the others who are defined as defined as a Merkava and the Holy Tanya?
Oh yeah.
Oh. Anyway, so the supernal angels are so we say here they're batul b'pel mamash, meaning in actuality. Why do we say in actuality? Because we're contrasting them, continues the Alter Rebbe, bein b'kayach and in potentiality. There's bittul in potential, a very important point that will be expanded on later in Tanya. Kechol ish Yisrael lamata, like every Jew here below, shebekaycha liyas batul mamash l'gabei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who has the potential to be literally nullified to God, b'mesiras nafshay al kedushas Hashem, by sacrificing his soul, giving up his life for the sanctification of God's name. This is actually like a little preview of later in Tanya, because later in chapter 18, this becomes a whole centerpiece of the discussion, this concept. Here, we're merely alluding to it briefly, right? What is the Alter Rebbe saying? The Alter Rebbe is saying that just as the angels literally are constantly, actually in service of God, every Jew is constantly, potentially in service of God, is constantly ready, in other words, to give up their life, al kedushas Hashem, for the sanctification of God's name, which basically means there are other cases that may fall under this category, but the basic example, which we'll use in chapter 18, God willing, when we get there, the basic example is when someone comes to convert the Jews, which happened unfortunately many times in history, right? And they say, either you bow down to this idol or you die. Many, many Jews chose death, right? Which in itself is not really significant until you understand that these were Jews who had no love of Judaism whatsoever until this moment. That's really what's exceptional about it, right? Is that Jews who don't really express their Judaism much in their life necessarily, their connection to God remains extremely in potential, right? When you say a student has potential, it's not a compliment, right? Their connection to God remains only in potential, but that potential is then actualized in a time of crisis, as Alter Rebbe will explain in chapter 18, and that actualization in the Nisayon, in the test, in the time of crisis, is bringing out instantly that potential that every Jew has. So in other words, every Jew has within them, by dint of the godly soul, right, the peace of God above that is within the Jew, they have the ability to be like an angel at a moment's notice, right? When we say at a moment's notice, what you should hear is without any effort or exertion or work or refinement needed whatsoever, right? In other words, just because you're Jewish and you have that godly soul, you have the ability at a moment's notice to bring out, to actualize that potential and sacrifice oneself for God. This is a very, very important point, because what the Alter Rebbe is basically saying, and as a theme of Tanya, is that the Jews' abilities cannot be assessed by the state they are from the outside. In other words, we were touching on this last week as well, that this whole definition of Kedusha versus Sitra Achra, it rearranges everything. One of the things that it rearranges is this idea that there's a particular thing that godliness looks like, right? The Alter Rebbe is saying here, every Jew, no matter what they look like, look at what they look like, meaning morally, spiritually, do they learn, do they daven, it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter what they look like, it's an essential fact, right? That's really what a potential means, right? A potential really means that it is inherently waiting to be brought forth. It's an inherent quality of the soul, right? That they are able to be bata like an angel. They're able to have total, they are, at a moment's notice, they can totally renounce their own existence of the animal soul and the body, which are what is covering over what's making this potential remain a potential. They have the ability at any moment to renounce that existence and choose a godly existence, which means that even a Jew who never actualizes this potential, right, has an incredible ability to be holy, an inherent connection to holiness at any time, at any moment, right? It could come out at any second. So even though, as it says later in Tanya in chapter 29, even though the regular day-to-day existence of a Jew literally is a Sitra Achra existence, right? From the Nefesh HaBahamis, a Klippa and Sitra Achra existence, the animal soul is our regular experience of life with our human intellect, which is really properly called the Nefesh HaSichlis, if it's working properly, the intellective soul. And then you have the animal soul, which is the more emotive existence of the, or emotions-focused existence of the Jew. But we do not live a godly soul existence. Jews who are not tzaddikim do not live a godly soul existence at every moment. They live an animal soul existence. In other words, a Jew senses I am separate from God, right? How refined that animal soul is will determine whether I am a very nice person who helps little old ladies across the street, or I am a very not nice person who does not help little old ladies across the street, right? That is all an animal soul issue. However, because the godly soul is also a soul within a Jew, and again, this is all allusions to what comes later in Tanya, because that godly soul is in a Jew, there is this profound potential to turn away from the worldly I am and embrace the inner divine I am to be a statement of God, to be a messenger of God, right? At literally any moment. The Jews, after all, are called at Mount Sinai a holy nation, right? And you would say, I've met some Jews and they're not so holy. What's the old joke, right? The anti-Semite says, I hate Jews, right? But if you ask him about his You ask him about his accountant, he says, oh, I love my accountant, I love my doctor, right? Jews, when you say, do you love the Jewish people? He says, Mika Amchi Yisrael, the greatest people in the world, the Jewish people. You ask him, do you like the Jews you know? Shmak, Patz, I hate him, he's the worst, right? And the Jewish people are the greatest people, right? It's the difference between the Jew and the anti-Semite. So you could say, when God says the Jewish people are a holy nation, right? You could say, but what about most of the time, right? Even in the Tanakh, most of the time, even if you read the Torah, most of the time, the Jews are not fulfilling that destiny in the most holy, in the truest way, right? This is really what it means. What it really means is not that they will all be tzaddikim all the time. That's not what a holy nation means. A holy nation means a nation with an inherent propensity, an inherent ability just beneath the surface to turn away from the worldly I am and embrace the divine I am. Or even shorter, it's referring to the godly soul. The fact that the Jew has a godly soul means that the Jew has a connection to holiness no matter what the animal soul does. And because we now understand what holiness and non-holiness mean, we can understand that what the animal soul does doesn't make sense that it would be able to affect the holiness of the godly soul. Right? It affects how that holiness is expressed or how often, etc. Right? And of course, the refinement of the animal soul, on the contrary, is actually the entire point. Right? But if you don't refine your animal soul, it doesn't make the Jew less holy, because holiness is not about personal refinement. No connection. What's ma'akesher b'chla? What's the connection? It's a non sequitur. There's no connection between the two things. Right? Holiness is a godly soul fact. Right? It is a godly soul fact of existence. Refinement and being a good person in your animal soul in your day-to-day existence is a separate fact.
Yeah.
So, does Chassidus agree or disagree when people say, some people throw up their hands at all of the difficult metaphysics and complex philosophies of the Torah and angels and spiritual worlds and the Orient Sof, and they say the bottom line of the Torah is that you're supposed to be a mensch, which, by the way, they have a good basis for this, because they're taking after, of course, who? Rabbi Akiva, yeah, exactly, and also Hillel, of course, both of them. Similar thing. They said, right? One said Klal Gadol B'Torah, right? One said this is a Kol Torah Ve'idach Pirushahu, right? The rest of the Torah is only commentary. So they have good basis from the Talmud they have good basis from the Talmud to say that Judaism is all about being a mensch and being a good person, right? Would Chassidus agree or disagree?
Yes.
Good, elaborate.
It agrees. You have to be a mensch, but it doesn't make you holy or not holy.
I would say slightly different. You're right. No. That's not a you're wrong, Sue. That's a I think there's a better way to say it, Sue. The better way to say it, I think, is that Chassidus would agree that the entire Torah is about making you a good person, but it introduces whole new levels of what being a good person means. That's really the vort, right? Being a mensch in the usual sense for Chassidus is meant to be a baseline. That is just having a refined animal soul, right? More refined in animal soul terms, right? The transformation of the animal soul, what the Alter Rebbe called the entire purpose of Chassidus, which is L'shanos Teva Midosav, to change the nature of the emotions of the animal soul. That is a whole other thing, which has to do with holiness and is an entire different avodah, is an entirely different. So what we normally would have thought as being a mensch is really just the baseline. There's higher hecher or noch hecher. There's higher and higher that you can go, as the famous Hayom Yom says. One of my favorite Hayom Yoms is that Chassidus shows a person how low they are and how high they can become, right? In other words, or as it was put at the time of the Tanya's publication, that the Alter Rebbe removed the narishkeit from Welt. The Alter Rebbe removed the foolishness, the childishness from the world of what we think is a good person and a bad person, right? Before the Tanya, you could convince yourself, I'm a tzaddik. You start reading Tanya, you see what it's like, right? Okay. So
it's easier to become a tzaddik when you're a snake.
It's easier. That reminds me of a different story. That reminds me of the story of the Maggid of Yerushalayim. What was his name? Who used to give? He used to speak every Friday night. People used to go to Zichron Moshe in Yerushalayim, the shul, after the meal, people would come from all around the city, they would walk, and they would come and hear the Maggid of Yerushalayim. This rabbi used to give a drasha that night, which was very, very beautiful. People from all different communities and things used to come. There's books about him called like the Maggid Speaks in English. They have the books. Anyway, so the famous story is that I'm not going to do it with the song. The correct way to do it is with the song. You can contact me after the class. I'll find you the clip of Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson singing it with the song. But long story short, a student comes to the Maggid of Yerushalayim, to this rabbi, and he asks him. He passed away not long ago. This is recent history. A student came up to the Maggid of Yerushalayim, and he says, "I'm a very jealous man, Rabbi." He says, "Why are you jealous?" He says, "I'm jealous of the animals, the cows and the goats and the sheep." He says, "Why are you jealous of the cows and the goats and the sheep?" He says, "Because the cow, when he wants to eat, he just bends down and he eats grass. And the cow doesn't have to get dressed in the morning. And the cow, when he wants to go to the bathroom, he doesn't have to move from where he's standing. He just goes to the bathroom right there. And the cow doesn't have to keep Shabbos. He doesn't have to wash until his Yadayim. He doesn't have to keep Yom Tov. Doesn't have to wear tzitzis. Doesn't have to put on tefillin. Doesn't have to do any of these, a whole list of obligations on my head." He's telling the Maggid of Yerushalayim. He says, "I'm jealous. I wish I was a cow. I'm jealous of the behemoths. They fulfill the will of God. They fulfill exactly what they are without any of these human, with all this human narishkeit, all these restrictions, all these mitzvahs, all the demands of the Torah on your head. I'm jealous. I wish I was an animal," right? And he started crying, right? This yeshiva student. And so I'll tell you what he said to me in Yiddish, and then I'll translate. He says, "Bacher, du hast nicht was zu weinen, du bist der Behemoth," right? Student, you have nothing to cry about. You are an animal, right? In other words, being jealous of the animals, you are an animal, right? So yes, it's easier to be a tzaddik without chassidus. That is true. Anyway, the godly soul wants to be, as we're going to read later in Tanya, wants to give up its life for God. That's really what the godly soul wants to do. The godly soul, interestingly, wants nothing more than to not exist. As we learn later in Tanya, it wants to be totally batal in the Or Ein Sof and to cease existing. It's the famous mashal, and also later in Tanya is the mashal of the flame on the wick, is the famous metaphor, right? The flame is always pulling upward. The body and the nefesh habahamis are the wick that hold the flame downward. If there was no body and nefesh habahamis, the fire ceases to exist, which in the Hasidic understanding is because the Yesod HaEsh, which is the divine tendency of histalkus, of withdrawing within oneself, is where the source of the elemental fire, which is in turn the primary source of physical fire. I know it's very complicated, but this tendency, when the fire disappears from the wick, it's actually withdrawing into its own source. It's not disappearing, it's returning to the natural state of fire, which is actually to be dark and not to glow and not to give warmth and not to be. It's only things when fire gets opposition that it gives off light and gives off. It's a very profound metaphor. We'll get to that later when we get to it. The godly soul wants to not exist, which is yet a further, I keep saying this, is yet a further demonstration of the fact that holiness has nothing to do with self-perfection, right? Because if God is the greatest existence and most perfect existence, and to be a good person means to become closer to God, more like God, right? A more perfect and a more whole, right? And a more in being, a more existent existence, so to speak, right? Then the godly soul would want not to cease existing, but to exist. And there's also truth to this as well. The whole thing is very complicated, but the godly soul would like nothing more than to become nothing in the Or Ein Sof, which in fact is a greater something than it is now, right? But the point still remains, it doesn't want to have its own perspective. It doesn't want to be the one that experiences being in the Or Ein Sof, because the Or Ein Sof doesn't have experiences. The Or Ein Sof is just God's presence, right? It doesn't want to be a self. It wants to stop being a self, right? Because it's the divine I am. It's God saying I am. God saying I am does not naturally become a self, because it's a statement. How do words become a self, right? We'll talk about how things become selves maybe a little bit later in this chapter, God willing. Maybe even tonight if we get that far. Okay. So you have that the bittul of the angels in actuality is the bittul of the Jew in potential, b'koyach. At any moment, the Jew has this potential for bittul. And these are examples of things that are holy. These are the Alter Rebbe's examples of holiness. The angel is holy actually all the time, because all it is an expression of God. And the godly soul at any moment, right, could be Meiser Nefesh, could totally give up its existence, right, its worldly existence, its biological existence, right, for the sake of Hashem. Right? Which again, when the godly soul chooses that, when the godly soul comes out and decides, which is not a rational desire, by the way, it comes and decides it can't be separate from Hashem, it would rather die than be bow down to an idol, than be separate from Hashem. Right? When the godly soul decides this, it's choosing to be an expression of Hashem rather, right, than to continue existing as a separate biological existence. That's why it's Kedusha. That's why it's holiness. Yeah, this is all clear. It was a bit haphazard, but we got there. Okay. V'lechein, therefore, I'm at the period, the only one on the page. The only new sentence on the page. Can't miss it. V'lechein, therefore, Amur Razal, the sages say, Shafilu echad sheyeshev esek b'Torah shchina shruya chulu, even a single Jew that sits and studies Torah, the Shechina dwells there. The presence of God dwells there. The point being, Torah, we understand Torah is holiness because Torah is the mind of God. It's literally a divine expression, right? But that's not what this says. What we're saying when we say this famous statement that even a single Jew studies Torah, the Shekhinah dwells there. We're saying the Shekhinah dwells on the Jew, not on the Torah, right? In other words, the Shekhinah dwells on the Jew, and the question is who says this Jew is so holy, right? I found some random guy and I start studying something it says in Torah somewhere with him, and all of a sudden the Shekhinah, the presence of God, is dwelling here. It would seem that this person may never have learned Torah before and may never learn Torah again. But at this moment, when they're studying something from the Torah, the Shekhinah dwells there, right? This is the Alter Rebbe, in other words, saying this is only because he's a piece of God, because the godly soul has this inherent connection with holiness, and that's why when a Jew, even a single Jew, studies Torah, the presence of God can dwell on him, within him, right? Can dwell on him. And the Jew is basically in a state of holiness because he has that inherent connection to holiness that just needs to be brought out. V'chol be'asara, and then another point, v'chol be'asara shchinta shari la'olam. On every group of 10 Jews, the divine presence rests, and the Alter Rebbe adds la'olam. The Alter Rebbe adds forever, to the quote from the Gemara in, I believe, Sanhedrin. Yeah. Top of the class. Sanhedrin 39a. Every group of 10 Jews, in other words, they don't have to be learning Torah or davening. Right? It's because of their inherent holiness. Another point is repeated again, right? The Jew brings holiness to the table, right? The Jew brings holiness with him. That's the inner meaning of the saying, I bring nothing to the table. It really means the nothingness of bittul. The Jew brings nothing. He brings bittul, he brings kedusha and holiness to the table. So any group of 10 Jews, even a group that's not praying or davening, the divine presence rests on them. And being Jewish, right, is inherent. That's why the Alter Rebbe adds the word la'olam, right? Forever, always, any group of 10, the Shekhinah dwells in any group of 10 Jews, always, meaning because if they're Jewish, by definition, the Shekhinah will dwell on a group of 10 of them. Because it's not their behavior, it's the godly soul which is holy within them. Aval, however, this was very nice to talk about holiness, but I thought this was chapter 6, we were supposed to be talking about the Klippa and Sidra Achra. So now back to our main topic. Aval, however, kol ma she'enei batel etzli yisbarich, everything that is not nullified to God, may he be blessed, elahu davar nifrad b'fnei atzmoi, but rather here you have, Sidra Achra is a davar nifrad, a very important term, a separate thing from godliness, bifnei atzmai, it's separate in itself, right? In other words, it is a separate self. Almost the literal translation of nifrad bifnei atzmai means it's separated into its own self, right? I'm just telling you what I've been saying since chapter 1. I was not entirely made up. If it's separate into its own self, if it's not batel, not nullified, it does not receive chayes mikdushaso shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. holiness from the holiness of God, mebechinas pnimius. It doesn't receive that vitality from the holiness of God in an inner way, mebechinas pnimius hakadusha, mohusa va'atzmusa, bechvedo ba'atzma. A lot of adjectives. It doesn't receive from the inwardness of holiness and its essence and itself, b'chvedo ba'atzma, in its glory itself. Ella, rather, mebechinas acharayim. It receives rather from what's called the acharayim, the hindquarters, the behind of godliness. This is really, we begin to answer the question, but I thought everything is from God, right? Or better, maybe even more precise, how do you get something which is in denial of holiness if it comes from God? Because the source of everything is in holiness, right? The source of everything is in the natural expression of godliness. Everything comes from the infinite light of God. Everything comes from the divine expression, the divine presence from holiness, right? So when God makes the Sitra Achra, right? When God makes something that is a davar nifrad, a separate thing, something that is in denial of its own source in godliness, something that says I am rather than is an expression of what God is, right? There has to be some explanation, you would think, right? There's something else has to happen for the Kedusha, the holiness of God, to become the Sitra Achra, for it to become something else. And this is really an explanation of where does the Sitra Achra come from, right? Because everything ultimately has a source, of course, in God. Let's get that clear, right? Everything comes from God, which means that everything comes from holiness, which is the divine presence, right? The question is, how then do you get some things, in our reality, the vast majority of things, right? As the Tanya itself will shortly say, how do you get the non-holy from the holy, right? To really understand this, I think we have to revisit something we spoke about in chapter 1, which is the idea that existence is not neutral in Chassidus. In other words, worldly philosophers, Seichel Enushi, and this is what makes human intellect a intellect of the Klipa and Sitra Achra, as we'll discuss more in chapter 8 of Tanya, right, when we discuss Chachmas Chitzonius, the external superficial wisdoms, right? Human intellect, which is of the Klipa and Sitra Achra, right? When Aristotle or who's someone else?
Even the Rambam, when he was talking philosophy, you can say that.
Why do you have to leap for
I don't know, because it
why
jumped
do you have
in
to
my
leap
head.
for the most difficult case? Start for something easy, right? When a non-Jewish thinker, right, or perhaps a Jew when they're looking at the world only with the nefesh habahamis, quite plausibly, right? When a nefesh habahamis, let's put it that way, when an animal soul looks at the world, right? Even when it's thinking its most abstract philosophy, which is really the nefesh hasichlis, again, not just the nefesh habahamis, it's the intellect of soul, which at some point we're really going to have to talk about, maybe even some more, because it's very important. But when the human intellect, regular human intellect, looks at the world, right, existence is taken for granted. Why is existence taken for granted? It's taken for granted in a specific way. It's not entirely taken for granted, but what I mean, obviously, when I say it's taken for granted, I don't mean that when you look at something, you don't ask where does it come from. Obviously, we ask that. In fact, that's the basis of all thinking, right? Is to look at something and say, what's the cause of this thing? Everyone asks that. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that the animal soul, right, has this condition. It's like think of it like a disease. It has this disease which is called existence, right? It exists, Yeah. Therefore, when it sees everything else, it sees it relative to its own existence, right? So in other words, for the chair to exist means that it interacts with my existence in some way, which it does, right? For 2 + 2 = 4 to exist, it interacts with my existence in a very different way, right? And how those ways are ordered, or if one's up higher or lower or whatever, that's an issue for the philosophers about which they all speak at great length, right? They can argue about that forever. But the point is, it's all based on, right? Or a different way of saying it is, what is all thought trying to explain? It's trying to explain things that exist. Why? Because all thought is had by beings that exist, right? It's all things that interact with me. It's all things in my world, right? First, I am within the world of all the other existences. There's a big cosmic fish tank where all the existences are all floating around in there, right? I'm dropped in there, and all of a sudden I see, oh, there's all this other stuff that exists, and now I'm trying to make it make sense, make it organized, see how everything fits together. That's what it means to think with an Nefesh HaBahamis. Yeah. The Torah says something radical. It was radical when it was first said, and it's still radical now. The Torah says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Radical statement. What's radical about this statement? Existence is not a given. Right? Existence is something that was made to exist, which is not something you can really understand, and the Torah acknowledges that in the Ramban on the first verse of the Torah, which says that this was a process of yesh ma'ayin, which is a different way of saying something from nothing, which is a different way of saying we can't understand it. That's a different way of saying it, right? Because you would think that to make existence itself exist, that means there has to be a prior concept of existence. The philosophers could explain this all to you, but the bottom line is, it's not something that we can really understand. But everything was made to exist from nothing. Existence is not a given, right? Existence is not the end all and be all. Now, some people say that God is existence itself, right? Why do they think that? Because they took all the small and limited and bound by time existences of the world, and they work their way up. This depends on something, and this depends on something, and this depends on something bigger and more eternal. And eventually they found the biggest and most eternal thing possible, right? Which is one single united eternal God. Yeah. So they find God as existence itself, so to speak, right? Or something like that. So when Judaism comes and says that that existence is created, there's a divine act to bring about existence, right? Which is the Kabbalah's understanding of these matters. Don't think that it's simple. On the contrary, there's a million other opinions, right? But Kabbalah's opinion, when I say Judaism, I mean Judaism as the Tanya understands Judaism, right? When Judaism says that the world is created, existence is created, this means, number one, God is not existence. God is beyond existence, as the Maharal of Prague famously writes in the second introduction to his Sefer Gvuras Hashem. Highly recommended. And second of all, it means that what we call existence was created. Okay, why is that relevant to this discussion? Because the Klippa and Sitra Achra, because it is an existence, does not see a valence to existence. You know what this word is, valence? I have no idea what it is in Hebrew here.
No clue what it is in English.
I'm looking at it. I'll meet you halfway. I know what it means in English, but I don't know what it means in Hebrew here. I'm going to Google translate this. Which is valence.
Yeah. Is it like surveillance? Or is it like a veil?
Valence.
Veil, something like
No. Valence, it translates as erchiyut. Erchiyut.
Erchiyut.
Oh, erchiyut, sorry. Which means, in English, don't say valence. Value, right? Something like that.
Yes, has value. It's appreciated or something.
Yeah, valence means like if you have a 2, it could be either positive 2 or negative 2, right? If you say I walk 15 feet, it could be either north or south. North or south is the valence, right? When we look at existence, we don't see existence as having a valence, because existence is a given, right? In other words, we see existence as a point, not as my father would say, not as a vector, right? We see existence as a point, right? It either exists or it doesn't exist. It's binary, right? And there's zillions of things that exist. To the Klippa and Sitra Achar, God is one of the things that exists, right? As we discussed this in chapter 1, when we said the Klippa and Sitra Achar is happy to say, I am, and God also is, right? Because there's this big thing called things that am, or things that be, things that are, right? This verb, being, existing, aring, right? Amming, this verb, right, is which is referred to in Chassidus as hishavos, right? Things that are brought into isness, right? Things that are, as Tzvi Kilov writes, things that are isified. God is the isifier, right? That's what Shem Havaya means, the isifier. So the four-letter name of God, as it says in Charich Dva'emuna, chapter.
Exactly.
4, I want to say. It says that Shem Havaya, the four-letter name of God, means to constantly bring things into existence. Yeah. So this verb of to is, right? We see it as totally neutral. Anything can be or can't be, right? In other words, and in fact, it has nothing to do with the teichen or the mahus of what the thing is. Yeah, so in other words, it happens to be that a unicorn does not exist, but a rhinoceros does exist, right? There's no explanation, really, fundamentally, in what they are as to why a rhinoceros should exist and a unicorn shouldn't exist, right? It's just, existence is just one of these things. Some things happen to actually have come into existence and other things didn't, right? Existence, and it doesn't mean gashmias either. You could make the same argument beruchnias, right? You could make it spiritually with concepts and abstracts and like mathematics and all this sort of thing, right? Where 2 + 2 = 4 exists, right? There you have very weird definitions of existence. Anyway, the point is we don't see existence as being a term with a direction. That's what I like, valence, right? It doesn't have a direction that it's pointed. In Chassidus, existence is a creation of God, which means existence is dual. It's not one thing. It's not just it exists or it doesn't exist. There's two things to existence. There is what the thing is, and then there's how it relates to its source, which is God. At the level of existence, at an existential level, right? In other words, I don't think the chair has profound thoughts about God, right? We're not saying it relates to God in its thoughts. We're saying it relates to God in the very fact that it exists. It relates to God. Only from a Kedusha perspective, only from a holiness perspective. From a holiness perspective, when everything is the presence of God, right? The presence of God dwells there, which means that the divine I am is heard there, right? Or if you prefer to use a very simple expression from the Tanya, it's like there's a malach there. There's a message. It becomes a messenger of God, right? When it's a messenger of God, the messenger is never saying, I'm all there is, because then they're not a messenger, right? Kedusha means there's what I am, and then there's who I represent, right? There's not just Eliezer, there's Avram. Eliezer says, Eved Avram Anechi. There's me, I'm the Eved, that's something else, not my Adon, I'm not Avram. But what am I? I'm Avram's man. I'm Avram's extension. I'm his shliach, I'm his messenger. So in Kedusha means that the thing agrees to be a messenger of God. It knows, it expresses, it's felt there, it's heard there, that it's a messenger of God, right? When we say that the Tefillin have Kedusha, or the Sefer Torah has Kedusha, right? We're really saying something very profound, which is that at the very level of existence, this thing represents something higher than itself. It's not just a denuded, which is probably too much of an English word. It's not just a bare, it's not just a naked existence. There's no existence stop, right? In truth, there's no just exists. There's no such thing. Nothing just exists, right? If you believe existence is all there is, right, and the existence is the highest level and existence is not created, then of course existence is all there is. In fact, it's a tautology. It's self-defining. And that's what it means to is, right? Saying existence is all there is means ising is all there is. Yeah, of course, that's by definition, right? But in Chassidus, is a verb performed by God, right? Is not what everything is inherently, right? Is only comes from God. So the very act of existing, when you see that something exists, you should see it as an expression of God. Why don't you see it that way? Because you're looking at it with the eyes of the Klipa and Sitra Achra, right? You're looking at it with Seichel Enushi, with the human intellect, human eyes. The human intellect and human eyes are creations of the Klipa and Sitra Achra. They see existence as inherent. Why? Why? Right? I understand the chair doesn't exist eternally, right? I understand that someone had to make this chair. So when I say the existence is inherent, what do I mean? I mean the fact that it's here is a given, right? It's here is not a statement about God. There's no, why would a statement about the existence of the chair be a statement about the existence of God, right? It's two separate things. Even if I can see how God ultimately exists from this chair, the existence of the chair is a separate thing from the existence of God. Right? Because existence is aside from technicalities, existence is self-sustaining, it's self-perpetuating, right? When we explain how this chair got here, we only are explaining how the parts were put together and things like that. But the fact that parts existed to be put together, that anything existed to make this chair, is taken as a given. We don't, when I ask you how did this chair get here, you don't start, well, first existence had to be brought about from nothing, right? That's because you look at it with the eyes of Klipa and Sitra Achra. Yeah? Why does the Klipa and Sitra Achra have to look at everything that way?
Because God is concealed. He has a concealed God. Otherwise,
what's a different way of saying God is concealed to the Klipa and Sitra Achra? From their perspective, the whole ikar of their creation, the seed of where they come from, is that existence is a given. Because that's what Klipa and Sitra Achra means. Sitra Achra means I'm alienated from my own source, right? I exist. I am. How do you get from God saying I am to a separate self which perceives itself to be an existence separate from him? Right? Right? The answer is, well, yes, but you get to many tzimtzumim, as we're going to read, right? Many self-concealments of God. But the point is that the self-concealment is the ikar of the Klipa and Sitra Achra. It's the essence of the Klipa and Sitra. That's what they are, right? When a human mind, which is of the Sitra Achra, looks at a chair, right, it has to grant that the chair can just exist. Why? Because its deepest sense of self is that it just exists. That's the answer. The answer is that the Sitra Achra does not question existence, because questioning existence would mean questioning itself, would be an act of self-destruction for the Sitra Achra. Right? The Sitra Achra wants to keep existing, and to keep existing, we have to keep pretending that existence has nothing to do with God. Because if something has to do with God, then the Sitra Achra stops being Sitra Achra and becomes Kedusha. Yeah? It stops becoming the other thing from holiness, and it becomes holiness, which means it loses its sense of self, right? In a certain sense, in a certain way, it will lose its sense of self. Eliezer had a very good sense of self. That doesn't mean he wasn't the Avram's messenger. You understand the distinction? That's what I mean by lose a sense of self. Anyway. What's the point of all this? The point of all this is that when God creates the Sitra Achra, how does he create it? He creates it over command, right? Basar Kasfei, the one that gives over his shoulder, right? Which is an explanation of this term, the Acharayim, right? It comes from the hind part, the hind quarter. What does that mean? What do we mean by the hind quarter, right? There's two things. And they're really related. In fact, I think they're kind of the same thing in a way. The first point, when we say it comes from the Acharayim, is that it doesn't come from what God really wants. That's the first thing it means, right? How does Klipa and Sitra Achra get its vitality? Like one who gives something to their enemy over their shoulder, right? As the famous expression goes, right? In other words, I'm not facing you. I'm not giving you my full. I don't want to give this to you. I'm giving this to you because certain circumstances force me to give this to you, right? It's like, as we say in modern American, as we say it's self-imposed force, but still, as we say in American politics, you vote for someone while you hold your nose, right? So that's what God does with the Klippa and the Sitra Achra, right? God doesn't face it; He's moving His nose as far away as possible. I don't want to look at this thing that I'm doing because my true desire is for holiness, not for Klippa and Sitra Achra. But I need Klippa and Sitra Achra to exist for whatever reason, which could be discussed. And since I need it to exist, I give it with acharayim, like I give it while it faces my back. I give it to exist. These things that deny that deny holiness, or the opposite of holiness. These things that aren't batal. These things that are separate. The second meaning is that everything that comes from the Sitra Achra comes from chitzonius. It comes from the outer side of holiness, the outer aspect of the holy realms, the realm of holiness. This outer aspect is very similar to this concept that we've been discussing, that existence is given to it in a way of where existence is neutral rather than God-focused. In other words, holiness, like the Torah as it is in the supernal worlds, for example, or the world of Atzilus, or the Or Ein Sof, whatever your example is, right, is God saying, I am. Where does the klippa come from? How do you get a separate I? You get a separate I through am, through this idea of existence, of neutral existence, right? If God says I am, that means something other than God is there, right? Eliezer is not Avraham, right? The Malach isn't God, right? This separation, the fact that there's the one who sends the messenger, who is not the messenger, even if the messenger is totally batul to the highest level, right? The fact that there is an Eliezer Avram distinction, right? A Malach Hashem distinction, that the messenger is not the one who sends the messenger, right? The fact that there is something called the divine presence, which is not God Himself, that is the ultimate source. That's the acharayim. Right? In other words, the whole point of God saying I am is that it's God who's saying it. That's the panemius. That's the inner truth of Kedusha, right? Is that all that exists is God. It's God saying I am, right? But there is still, even though it's God saying I am, this introduces a certain dimension of there being something other than God, even though it's totally batal, but it's now a statement, it's now an expression of some kind, right? This is what we call the chitzonius, right? Which means how a thing relates externally. It's connected to other things we've already said, but I've already gone too long. Besides the point, that's why I think the two explanations are the same, right? It's not the reason God says I am. It's something that He doesn't really want directly. It's a byproduct, in other words. It's like, not what you can't really say about God. Like you were saying, you can't say God is forced to do anything, right? But in a certain sense, the way that God wants holiness to be is in a world where there can be a choice between holiness and non-holiness, and good and evil, right? And that free choice should exist, and reward and punishment should exist, and all these different principles of Judaism and things that God wants, right? So the ultimate source in holiness for things that deny God is from this acharayim, it's from this chitzonius, it's from the fact that there is such a thing as am. Even though it starts as God saying I am, in Kedusha, am is a term that refers to God, right? Being is not stam. There's no stam metzias. Every metzias comes from God. Every metzias is an expression of God. Everything that exists is an expression of God in its very being. That's what it means to exist. To exist means to express God in holiness, right? Where does non-holiness come from? It comes from the fact that there is an expression versus thing that is expressing distinction, right? It comes from the acharayim. It comes from the outer part, right? Not the main thing, right? The byproduct, the way things relate externally, rather than the ikar, rather than the main point, right? This is all what chitzonius means. So, in other words, this is how you get from the divine I am to the I am of the Sitra Achra, a separate I am. It's obviously a very simplified explanation, right? But I think that's what's implicit in these words of the Alter Rebbe, right? When the Alter Rebbe says, it doesn't get from Bechinas Pnimiyas HaKedusha Mehuzah V'Atzmuz B'Chveda V'Atzma, Ela Bechinas Acharayim, right? And furthermore, what do we say about these acharayim? Sheyardim memadrega lemadrega revavas madregas b'ishtalshlus ha'olam as derech ilu va'olu. It descends from level to level in tens of thousands, myriads and myriads of hishtalshalus, which means in a chain-like descent of the world, derech ilu va'olu, in a way of close cause and effect. Yeah, as we're going to read. So, in other words, holiness is made to go through a cause and effect process. Now, the cause and effect, really the term ilu va'olu deserves its own 20 or 30-minute explanation of what this means. Close cause and effect. We've spoken about it in this class before, not in Tanya though. We were discussing this back in the Maimer of the Chanukah Maimer of the Rebbe Rashab, the difference between close cause and effect and creation something from nothing. But close cause and effect, right, ilu va'olu, implies that in a profound sense, the cause and the effect are really indistinguishable, right? That's why I translate it as close cause and effect, right? In other words, the cause and it's like what's an example of ilu va'olu? An example of ilu va'olu is like the thought behind the thing that you are saying, right? So the thought behind the thing that you are saying, right? The thought is the ilah, and the thing that you're saying is the alu, right? But the fact is that the ilah and the alu are really they're melded together at the point where cause meets effect, right? The thought that your words are expressing it's not causing it like from a distance, right? It's causing it directly by being part of, influencing directly, forming the thing that is expressed, right? A classic example in philosophy is that if you throw a brick at the window, right, the window breaks. The cause of the window breaking is the brick hitting the window, right? And the effect of the breaking is the window giving way to the brick, right? In other words, we're describing this close. That's why it's called a chain, right? Ishtalshalus. It's a chain of cause and effect because in the chain, the bottom of the top link is within and goes under the top of the bottom link, right? So they're interlinked like this. One thing is directly causing the next, really, without separation, right? So, when we say that holiness, when God saying I am, goes through these many, many steps, and as we're going to describe, through many, many tzimtzumim, and is transformed down, what does this really mean? It means that God takes He takes Kedusha, He takes His own presence, right? He takes God saying I am, and He puts it through, a way of putting it is maybe you could say it gets translated through many, many, many different levels, right? It gets translated to speak at the next level because it's like almost in a way, almost like a game of telephone, right? It gets brought down and brought down and brought down. What do we mean by brought down? Is a good question.
Every down is more concealment.
Yeah, but it's become circular, right? We're saying the source of concealment is that it's brought down through more concealment. The divine I am is made to speak about. It's like having lesser and lesser messengers, right? It's like first you send your best messenger. Then that messenger tells the next messenger to go. The same message, you're representing me and I represent God. Then a third messenger and a fourth messenger. Now, all you get from this is messengers, right? At some point there has to be some kind of break, which obviously there clearly is, right? There has to be something else added to this process. But by the time you get to like the millionth messenger, right? Or the 10 millionth messenger, Ravavos and Ravavos, right? Myriads and myriads, right? By the time you get to that furthest messenger, the idea that the message of God is I am, that it's the divine I am, of the original person who sent the first messenger, right? That message has become very, very, very attenuated. It's become very weak. It's become very...
It's like broken telephone.
The point is not that the message is lost exactly.
Right.
It's that the message becomes very, very weak. It's like you don't remember what's the connection between this thing and God. God has put so many things in between, right? There's so many different realities that this of God saying I am, that it's come down through, right? That it becomes shayach, it becomes possible that it can give vitality to something that actually denies God. In other words, once the message is so far away, so to speak, it's really using very grub physical terms for godliness, right? But I don't know how else to talk about it. Once the message is so far away and is so distant from the original sender, and you're now on the 10 millionth messenger, right? The 10 millionth messenger might not have the presence to prevent something from saying, who's this divine I am? Never seen him. He's 10 million people away. Who's this Avram? Who's this original sender, right? I'm doing my own thing. Right? Now, everything gets its vitality from holiness. In other words, there really isn't anyone doing their own thing, right? If there was no 10 millionth messenger, there would be no Klippa and Sitra Achra, right? The Klippa and Sitra Achra needs the message, right? But the point is that at some point the message becomes so distant from its original statement of God saying, I am, right? Where it's like the last messenger is just saying, I am
something.
I am, and then the klipa comes and says, maybe I am, right? Even though it's receiving that from the messenger, it gets the idea from the messenger, right? It gets existence from the messenger. But in what existence does it get? An existence in which God is very, very, very hidden, right? Very, very, very concealed. Even though the klipa and sitra achra also comes from kedusha, it also comes from holiness, right? This is basically how it happens. The divine existence, which is always about God, right, eventually becomes made so distant from the fact that it's really about God that it can become neutral existence. And neutral existence is the existence where the klippa lives, right, or at least klippa's nega. And once you get to the really bad klippas, they're not interested in neutral existence. They say, Li ha'ya'eri v'ani asisini, right, asisani, I, the river is mine and I made it, right? They start saying, I'm the only thing that exists, only I. What do you mean, me and God? Huh? This town's not big enough for the both of us, right? But even those klippas, which are the gimel klippas atmeas, as we're going to discuss, the three impure klippas, even those klippas, where is their vitality at every moment coming from? The vitality at every moment comes from kedusha, but it's kedusha that's become very, 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 very distant. And by the way, I feel like I'm not really explaining anything, because what does it mean to be distant? Why would putting more levels have any effect on the infinite presence of God? These are all very good questions that I don't know the answer to, right? I'm just telling you how we're describing it. We're saying, how does Sitra Achra get its vitality from Kedusha? The answer is through many, many, many steps of Ishtalshalus, right? How do we know that the Klippa and Sitra Achra gets its vitality from holiness? Here, this is the kicker. This is kind of the whole drawing the whole thing together. With this, we'll end class. How do you know that it does get its vitality from holiness? The answer is because it exists. Everything that exists gets its vitality from God, right? But the way that it exists is not necessarily a holy existence. Holy existence is for holiness. There's lots of things in our reality. Our reality is the reality of Klippa and Sitra Achra, as we would have read if we got further tonight in the Tanya. Our reality is a whole reality of Klippa and Sitra Achra. And here we have forgotten, or it is concealed, that existence means divine existence. Here, existence is a neutral term. Here, anything can exist. For God, against God, if it exists, right? And the Klippa and Sitra Achra play a big part in that. If there was no Klippa and Sitra Achra, and all existence was inherently perceived to be existence for God, you would not have a true Tachta and a true lowest world. You would have there's no game, exactly. There's no game. There would be no challenge. There would be no choice between holiness and non-holiness, because it would be like choosing between existence and non-existence, which is not a choice. You can't choose non-existence because there's nothing there to choose. You understand? You can't escape the truth, because the truth is all there is, as they say. All right. On that note, we will continue next week, God willing.
Yeah.